Hey, welcome back to my channel. My name is Bridget and I'm an artist and art educator. In this video, I'm going to show you how to use watercolor by painting a bunch of flowers. Now, in my previous videos, I've shown you how to make a watercolor piece from start to finish, including the drawing process. But in this video, I just want to show you how to use watercolor directly. For this piece, because there's so many details, I'm using a very small brush. And this brush has a fine tip to it, that way I can get into all the nooks and crannies and crevices. A key element in watercolor is, you guessed it, water. And throughout this video, I will be using a wet on dry technique, and then towards the end, I'll be using a wet on wet technique. And you'll see the difference. This is a wet on dry technique, meaning I'm using the wet paint onto the dry surface. Whereas wet on wet is using the wet paint onto a wet surface. So in watercolor, it's not typical to use white. Instead, we use the white of the paper that we're painting on. And so what we do is we dilute the paint with water, or we leave spaces without any paint at all. Watercolor paints usually come in either a palette that has the dried color on it, or it comes in tubes. Either way, what I like to do is I like to wet either the paint that's the dried form or the wet form, and add more water to it to create a little puddle, and then take from that puddle. So with watercolor, even though it comes in very small amounts, it's because you only need a small amount to work with. Watercolor paint comes very concentrated because the manufacturers know that you're going to add water to it. So that's why you don't need a lot of paint. So when you pick up a small tube at the store, or when you pick up a palette and you're like, hey, there's not much paint here. Actually, there's so much, because you're going to add water to it. And that's how you're going to play with the shades and the values throughout the colors, because you can add some more water to create lighter colors, or use less water to create a more concentrated, more pigmented, a bolder color. So what I like to do with my watercolor is actually build up in layers. So I paint a layer, then I wait for it to dry, and then I paint on top of it. So here I've added a layer of yellow, and that yellow hasn't completely dried yet because I am going on top of it with some pink, and I want those colors to blend. So if the surface that you're painting on is still wet, the colors will bleed together and blend together. But if it's dry, then your colors won't blend. So keep that in mind as you're working with watercolor. With other types of paint, you would have to do that blending and that mixing, whereas with watercolor, it does it on its own when it's wet. Water just attracts water and all the colors just bleed together. So because of that, we have to be very intentional with how we paint. You can see here I'm leaving some spaces white because that's where I don't want the colors to bleed. It's important to leave space between each section that you're working on if you don't want those colors to bleed into each other. You want each section to dry before painting right next to it, otherwise you'll have just a muddy mess. Continuing with the wet on dry technique, I'm taking a darker color of pink and I'm adding it to the edges of each of these flower petals on the rose. And then what I can do is I can go back in with some water and just blend using my brush. I gently rub the water in with my brush, and that way it will create a nice subtle gradient. Normally with watercolor, the water does all of the blending. However, when you use less water with your paint to create something that's darker, it dries a lot faster. So that means you will have to do a little bit of gentle rubbing just to re-wet it so that it can blend again. And of course, where I put my shadows and where I put my light really depends on the reference that I'm using. So I am following a reference photo just to guide where my light source is and how I do the colors and shading and everything. So I highly recommend working from a reference photo or a reference of a real bouquet in front of you, just so that way you know where the light is, where the shadows are, and you don't have to guess. So here you can see really well what I mean when I say I leave spaces in between each section. I'm working on one flower or one stem at a time and leaving white space between them, so that way they have a chance to dry and so the colors won't blend into each other. For this leaf, I'm doing a wet on wet technique, and you can see how the colors just sort of softly blend with one another once the water is added or not quite dry yet. And on this stem that's dry, I'm adding a slightly darker wash to create some shadows. For For these flowers, I'm adding some yellow with a little bit of burnt sienna, not a lot, just a little, to the middle of the flower. And then I'm taking a very light pink, so that's pink with some water added to it, for the outside petals, because these are a very beautiful ombre that go from like this yellow color to a peachy color. And I wanted to capture that. And I did this very quickly while the colors were wet, so that way they would blend together a little bit. So once these two flowers are dry, I'm going in and I'm painting blue to this leaf. And I did this so that the flowers could dry, and so I know that when I paint this blue leaf, the blue is not going to blend into the pink or bleed into the flower. What's really great about the brush that I'm using is that it is both round and flat, so it can get those slightly bigger spaces as well as get into those smaller, more detailed places like this greenery, depending on the angle at which I hold my brush. And again, here's another example of waiting for the previous sections to dry before going into the middle section. Like, I would not want this burnt sienna of this greenery or this extra filler flowers to blend into that pretty pink. So that's why it's important to be very patient with watercolor. Watercolor definitely teaches you patience. So for these extra filler pieces that I go in with burnt sienna, I'm actually going on top of it with a black that I made using burnt sienna and a little bit of blue. And that way it just cools down those filler pieces and they don't draw too much attention. And what I mean by cools down, if you don't already know, is that some colors are a little bit warmer and therefore they will stand out in the piece, but colors that are cooler like blue or green, they will recede back into the piece. So I don't want these filler pieces to steal the show from my prettier flowers. I want them to sort of recede into the background and just, you know, be the filler pieces that they are. So that's what I mean by I cooled them down. I took a cooler color with some blue just to make it recede into the background a bit. So for this fluffier stem, I'm using that wet on wet technique with a couple of different shades, and that way they will blend with each other and bleed into each other and create this nice fluffy full effect. Watercolor really teaches us how to both control as well as learn when to let go. So that's what I really appreciate about this type of art. You can't control everything in life, just like you can't control everything with watercolor. You just kind of gotta go with the flow. And finally, I'm completing this piece with this middle flower. If I had started with this flower, I would have had to wait for it to dry before working on any other part of the piece. So now that all of these flowers are dry, I can go back in with some darker shades and just really bring out those shadows to add more contrast to the piece. So this is going back to that wet on dry technique. And this contrast will really make the piece pop and really draw the eye. I'm using only a small amount of water for this, just enough to get the paint flowing and moving, but not enough for it to bleed in or to be diluted very much. I noticed that shadows typically go in between the petals or towards where the flowers sort of reach the rest of the bouquet, and just wherever the light cannot really reach as well. Again, it's important to work from a reference so that way you can really see where the shadows are and where they are not. Now, it's important to know that I have sped up this video. I mean, you can see here that I've really sped it up, but throughout this whole video, I've sped it up. In real time, it is a lot slower. So feel free to take your time. Don't rush through it. Watercolor is a slow practice. And once my watercolor is dry, I'm taking a pen and going in to create these fluffy stems. I forget what the actual name is of them, but I'm just taking a pen and creating little flicks. That way it will look like it's a very fluffy thing. Let me know in the comments if you know the name of this thing. I don't think it's called a pussy willow, but like it's something like that. Cattail, I don't know. But yeah, and then I'm taking that same sort of technique and I'm putting it in the fluffy piece from earlier. Again, I don't know what the name of that stem is. So if you know the names of any of these, please let us know in the comments. And for this one, I'm being a bit brave. I'm going in with just straight pen rather than pencil first, but don't you do that. Use a pencil first. And there you have it. This is the finished piece. I hope that you have enjoyed this video, that you've learned something, and that you can create your own very beautiful watercolor. If you like this video, give it a like, leave a comment, and subscribe if you want to see more. Thanks for watching.